Good morning. I hope everyone is doing well. We are going to start our second week's module. This week we'll be looking at the ethical theories of Immanuel Kant and John Stuart Mill. And these are two very different ethical approaches to the world. And one focuses on duty, and the other one focuses on the idea of maximizing pleasure. And that's kind of simplified, but we're getting ready to dig in a little bit and see how these theories actually work. I'm going to have a section of your screen will be a PowerPoint that I've used in the past when I taught business ethics. Now, obviously, you're not in a business ethics class. This particular PowerPoint presentation is very generalized and will be appropriate for what you'll need to know for the content for this week. And as always, if you have any questions or anything about what we're going through, please don't hesitate to reach out to me, and I will be happy to help you. So we're going to go ahead and get started with the ethical theory of Kant. And Kant's ethical theory is usually called, another term for it is deontology. And deontos in Greek means duty. So this is sort of a duty-based ethics. And Immanuel Kant is a very pivotal figure in Western philosophy. He has had a great deal of influence, I would say, not only in the world of philosophy, but also in the world of politics, because a lot of the founding fathers would have been familiar with Kant. And a lot of Kant's ideas are sort of in the background and influencing other philosophers, in this time, and philosophers like Locke and others like that. So we're just going to go ahead and go through, and I'm just going to walk you through these slides. And again, if you have any questions about anything, feel free to email me. So we're going to begin with this idea in ethics, and the idea in ethics that we're usually starting with is this idea of, well, what is good, okay, and what constitutes a good action, because obviously that's very important in an ethical theory. So for Kant, you have the good, and in your reading, if you came to it, he's going to say very early in your reading, which is from the groundwork of the metaphysics of morals, he's going to say nothing can possibly be conceived in the world or even out of it which can be called good without qualification except a good will. Now that statement's fairly important because here one of the things that Kant is sort of up to, remember last week when we read the Euthyphro, and there was some question about how religion dealt with morality. Well, Kant wants to try to take religion out of the sort of moral calculus that we make. It's not that he's necessarily hostile to religion, but he feels that there could be a better way of grounding morality instead of turning to things like, religion. And at this time, you have to remember that Kant is writing in the 18th century, and Europe has had about a couple of hundred years of a lot of internal and civil strife that came from the Reformation. So when you had the split between the Catholic Church and then the various Protestant churches that sprang up, there had been a good deal of war that had taken place. And so in Kant's mind, the idea of basing religion or ethics on religion for him would be sort of a dubious prospect, because all of these religions were sort of in conflict with one another. And so he felt, well, we have to live morally with one another, And if we're both going to the same book, such as the Bible, to find that morality, and yet we're treating one another so terribly, we might need to find something that is more universally accessible to people. And for Kant, that thing is going to be called a good will. Now, here in this next little bullet point, it talks about what the good will is. And Kant is going to talk, have a couple of critiques, even though he's writing before Mill, a form of utilitarianism where you're working toward the best possible consequence is going to be rejected, because for Kant, it's not possible to control the consequences of the action. We've all heard the old adage, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. Well, Mill or Kant might be a little wary of that statement, because he would say, look, in the end, the only thing that you can do is have a good intention. You can't necessarily control what happens once you begin to initiate a certain action in the world and how those consequences play out. The other thing that he's going to do is he's going to rule out this idea of the virtues, which will be something that we will look at when we come to Plato. And he kind of rejects it because he said that the virtues might be used toward evil ends. So if in your reading, if you remember, he'll talk about a moderate spirit could make a person a calm murderer. Now, let me just say this right here. These are Kant's thoughts on these things. This is not necessarily to say that Kant has no problems in his ethical theory. These are sort of contentions that he's making. And you have to remember that if he was talking to John Stuart Mill or to Plato, they would certainly have ways of defending their own ethical theories, okay? But moving along, for Kant, having the right intention is what makes the will good, okay? So if you have the right intention, your will is good. And then the question would be, well, what kind of intention is good? What kind of intention should I have? And the one here is that it should be an intention that acts solely on duty, okay? So that's the big part, all right? We're looking for the good, and for Kant, it's the good will. And then what is the good will, or what makes a will good, is having the right kind of intention. And then what kind of intention is good? Well, it's the one that acts solely on duty. All right. So then we'll kind of go and we'll talk a little bit about duty. A good will is one that acts solely for the sake of duty. Okay, so it acts solely for this. So he's going to ask a question: how can one distinguish when one acts with his mind on duty and when he acts egocentrically? So here's the point. You have an example that I think Kant uses in your reading, and it's the idea of the merchant or the grocer. I'm not sure how that translates in your, I can't remember quite off the top of my head how that translates in your reading. But he says, look, if you have a grocer or somebody who owns a store and he acts fairly toward his customers because he's kind of inclined this way, okay? Or maybe he acts fairly with his customers because he's really doing this because it's good for business. If he gets the idea of being an honest sort of merchant or store owner, then maybe that will help his business. Kant Kant says if that is the case, if he acts fairly because he's just inclined to do that, he's just kind of a nice person and has this sort of character, or if he's doing it because it's going to be good for business in the long run, even if he does the right thing and acts fairly, he is not necessarily doing it out of a goodwill. Okay. So he only acts fairly if he does it purely from duty. Okay. So if he recognizes that my duty is to act fairly, regardless of what my inclination might be, maybe I might be tempted to talk a customer into buying something they don't necessarily need. It wouldn't be terrible for them, but I'm kind of tempted to that. But no, I'm not going to do that because my duty is to be good. If you do that, even in the face of that inclination, then for Kant, you're doing the right thing. And then likewise, if you say, I'm going to act fairly with my customer, even if it means that it might hurt my business in the short term or maybe even the long term, Kant would say that person is acting morally. Okay. So we're going to have this other bullet point that says that Kant is introducing a more cerebral, and by that we mean mental concept to his theory. All right. And so this is going to be very, very, very important. Okay. What's really doing the work for Kant when we talk about how we understand what our duties are, what's doing the work is reason. Okay. And that's an important part that you need to kind of keep in mind. So a good will then is the determination to do what, in effect, reason requires is right. For there no other purpose other than what reason has determined. So for Kant, we're not acting morally because we have this sort of interior inclination to act that way or this sort of feeling. We're not doing it because of any future good or gain that we could get out of it, even if it's a universal good and not something necessarily for myself. The only reason that I should be doing this is because it is what reason is dictating for me to do. All right. And so at this point, you might be asking, well, how do we know what reason wants us to do? Well, here Kant is going to talk a little bit about, and you need to understand this a little bit, about what a human being is, at least according to Kant. And so human beings have sort of this dual nature, okay? There are these two portions that make up our human existence. We have this sort of sensual side and a rational side. So Kant would just say, hey, look, there's a part of our nature that's more animal in the sense that we get hungry, we grow, we reproduce, and we share this in common with other animals, okay? And then, but there's also this part of our nature that's more rational, okay? That we can, even if I'm hungry or something, sometimes I'm able to forgo the desire to eat for something else. So that means that animals, in Kant's views, animals other than human beings, are purely sensuous, okay, and are entirely subject to causal determination, which basically means animals have no free will, okay. If the animal mates, it mates because there is just an internal physiological sort of drive to do this or instinct at certain times, okay? You wouldn't find an animal foregoing mating to be celibate for some sort of reason. That just wouldn't happen. Okay, and because of this, because animals don't have free will, we do not apply rightness or wrongness to animals. Okay, they have no rational portion or no rational nature to take control of their actions. So we wouldn't fault the lion for killing the gazelle or even killing its own young. The other example that I use here is, let's just say, if you were at the college and they have the little cafe where people sometimes sit and eat, and let's just say that you walked away from your food for a moment and you came back, and maybe sometimes they have those birds, these kind of little larger black birds that are called grackles, and they tend to be sort of scavengers. And you come back and the bird is sort of pecking at your food. You would shoo the bird out of there. You would be angry at the bird, but your response to the bird eating your food would be much different than if you came back in another scenario. Instead of a bird eating your food, I am sitting down eating your food. Okay, because you would think, well, you're a human being and obviously you should know better. So we hold humans to a different standard than we would other animals. Okay, and then Kant says, but then you could have purely rational beings. Okay, and if there are any of these beings, they would act always in accord with moral principles. Okay, they would always conform to the dictates of reason. And so for Kant, when he's talking about, excuse me, purely rational beings, he has something in mind like angelic beings, okay? Because in theology, angels do not have bodies, they're pure intellect from a theological perspective. So they would always act in accord with reason. Okay, but Kant's not a theologian, obviously, and so he's not necessarily worried about that. He just says, if these beings exist, this is how they would exist. But Kant kind of rules out our ability to kind of know that. So he's much more kind of focused on sort of the human world. So he says, look, therefore, since animals are purely sensuous, and maybe there are these beings, these angelic beings that would be purely rational, obviously humans are sort of in between. We're not necessarily determined to act by natural impulse or instinct, because again, if I get hungry and I see your sandwich there and I'm walking by the cafe, I have enough in me to know that I shouldn't take your sandwich. It's not mine. Okay. But then, nor are we free necessarily from the non-rational impulse. Now, sometimes our our non-rational sort of desires and stuff sort of come in conflict with what we know that what we should rationally do. Okay, so thus we need, and reason is compelled to provide a principle that declares how we ought to act when it is in our power to choose. So basically, we need a code of conduct. And so this is going to be very important for Kant. So if we move along, before we get to that, he's going to say that, well, look, we need this code of conduct, but we have to recognize that we have two problems that are sort of inherent, just woven into the fabric of human existence. So one, we're not wholly rational beings, so we're liable to give in or succumb to our non-rational impulses. Okay, so that's a problem. Okay, And then the other part is even when we exercise our reason fully, often we cannot know which action is the best. Okay. And I think all of us sometimes have had um, situations like that where you're trying to decide. Maybe you see a friend doing something they shouldn't, um, and you want to talk to them about it, but you're not sure how to do it, and maybe they might take it the wrong way. You're trying to do the right thing and you're trying to think through it, but then sometimes it's kind of hard to know which action would be best because there's a difference between what we see, okay, in other words, how we're perceiving a situation, and then what the situation is in actuality, okay? And so humans are not determined to act by instinct fully, nor are we completely going to act fully according to reason, because there are better or worse ways of achieving our ends, and there are better or worse ends depending on sort of the criteria we develop in our ethical pursuits. So Kant then says, because of this, all right, we have to then assume there are two different kinds of objects in the world, and this adds another level of another moral dimension to our deliberations. So he's going to say there are two different types of things in the world, all right? And these things can be divided into two types of beings. There are beings with reason and will, like ourselves, like human beings. And because we can do this, we are ends in themselves. A human being is an end in itself. And the reason why is because we can act upon the world freely and through reason and other things. And so for Kant, he's just going to take it as just sort of common sense that human beings are the only things that do that in the world. So that means that things that lack those faculties are going to end up being a means to an end, okay, because they are acted upon by the world, all right? And so this is an important understanding for Kant. Ends in themselves, like human beings, are autonomous, which means we can self-rule ourselves with our own agendas. We can have our own sort of goals and pursuits in life that we want to pursue. And so failing to recognize their capacity to determine their own actions would be to thwart their freedom and undermine reason itself. So in other words, you don't treat a human being like you would treat a tree. The tree, I can kind of do whatever I want. I can climb the tree. I can cut it down for firewood if I needed it, use it for paper or do whatever. But I can't treat a human being like that because a human being is capable of acting upon the world in a way that the tree cannot. Okay? So, means to an end. This is our other type of being. These things are like buildings and rocks and trees and other animals. And for Kant, they don't deserve really any special status in our moral deliberations about the goals we should have and what means we would use to achieve them. And so obviously, if you're an animal rights lover, Kant, it might not be your person, okay? So moral actions are actions where reason leads rather than follows. Okay, so reason tells us what we should do. And actions where we must take other things into account that act according to their own conception of the law. So we have to sort of understand these things. Well, at this point, if we have two types of beings, then Kant's going to move to this idea that there are two types of laws, okay? And Kant distinguishes two kinds of laws produced by reason, okay? So there's one law that is called a hypothetical imperative. So let's just say we want to accomplish something. A hypothetical imperative is a rule of action that would say, if you wish to buy a car, then you must determine what sort of cars are available for purchase. Conceiving the means to achieve some desired end is by far the most common employment of reason. So basically, if you were writing out this like in a sort of an equation form, if you want X, do Y. That is a hypothetical imperative. Okay, an imperative just means a command. Okay, so if you want X, you must do Y. Okay. However, because some of our dealings will be with other humans who are not means to an end, the moral law that we derive cannot be merely hypothetical. Now, that doesn't mean that it can't be hypothetical, okay? If you wish to have a friend, then treat them fairly, okay? Now, if you don't wish to have a friend, then you don't do that, okay? But if you wish to have a friend, you lie to them. Well, for Kant, that would not be right, because at that point, you're treating the person sort of as a means to an end. You're not respecting their autonomy, okay? So morality requires an unconditional statement of duty. Hypothetical imperatives for Kant sort of reign over the sorts of things like how we do our daily work, how we might achieve building a bridge, what I might want to do with my day, and particularly if we're dealing with things that are means to an end, then these hypothetical imperatives are much more common. But once a human being comes into the realm of your consideration, or it is an action that's going to affect a human being, then for Kant says, at this point, you need an unconditional statement of duty. So you're not going to have a hypothetical imperative. You're going to have what Kant calls a categorical imperative. So sometimes if you've ever heard, a categorical statement, if you make a categorical statement, something like, all diseases are bad, okay, that's a categorical statement. You're saying that every form of disease is bad, okay? So he's going to say that reason produces an absolute statement of moral action. The moral imperative is unconditional, which means its imperative force is not tempered by the conditional if, like in our hypothetical imperative. If you want X, then do Y. Okay, so it's not tempered by the conditional if I want to achieve an end. It is then, and then where you say then do X, it simply states do X. So it would say be honest, be just. Not if you want to be just, then do whatever. It's just do that. Okay? So where the hypothetical imperative, if we wrote it as an equation, would just be seen as if you want X, then do Y. This would be do X, and that would be it. Okay? So Kant believes that that reason dictates a categorical imperative for action. he gives three formulations of the categorical imperative. So at this point in the lecture, I just want to stop for a second, and I want to point something out to you on this little slide here. You will see that there are three formulations of the categorical imperative. Now, in philosophy, and when we teach, we talk about the first categorical imperative and then the second categorical imperative. What we use for the second categorical imperative when we talk about it is actually this third bullet point, this third categorical imperative here. Okay? So, because if you look, let's just look at the first two. The first two say, act only according to that maxim by which you can, at the same time, will that it should become a universal law. Okay? And the next one is, act as though the maxim of your action were by your will to become a universal law. Okay? These first two imperatives, there is a subtle difference, but it's very subtle. And normally when we're just teaching this in an ethics class, we just refer to the first categorical imperative as one of the formulations of these two. So I would just say, just focus on the very top bullet point, act only according to that maxim by which you could at the same time will that it should become universal law. And then this second bullet point would be, or this third bullet point would actually be the second categorical imperative. Act so that you treat your humanity, whether in your own person or in that of another, always as an end and never as a means to an end. Okay? So those will be our categorical imperatives 1 and 2. The first bullet point is the first categorical imperative, and the second categorical imperative will be this third bullet point. And if I haven't thoroughly confused you, feel free to send me an email and I'll be happy to answer your question. So these are the two categorical imperatives. So Kant is going to just give an argument, and I'm going to go through these kind of quickly so we can get on to utilitarianism. But he says, so the arguments for the first version of the categorical imperative. What are Kant's arguments for this? Well, first, he says, consider the following example. Consider a person who needs to borrow some money, and he kind of is considering making a false promise to pay it back. All right, so I'm going to go to you and I need to borrow $20, but at the time that I'm asking you for the $20 and promising that I will pay you back that money, I am at the same time saying I will not pay that money back. Okay, I'm thinking that to myself. So the maxim that could be invoked is, when I need money, borrow it, promising to repay it, even though I do not intend to. Okay? But then remember the universality test of the first categorical imperative. Act in only that way in which you could make you could at the same time will your action to become a universal law. Okay? So when we do this, when we apply the universality test of this maxim, of the first categorical imperative, it becomes clear that if everyone were to do this, okay, the institution of promise making itself would be undermined, okay? And the borrower makes a promise willing that there be no such thing as promises. And that fails the universality test. Okay. And then the other one, sorry, go back. We have seen that in the inclination, in order to be good, we must remove the inclination and consideration of any particular goal from our motivation to act. So the act cannot be good if it arises from just a subjective impulse. Oh, I just feel like doing this right now, or this is just who I am. I'm just naturally a fair person or an honest person, and that's why I do that. Nor can it be good because it seeks some particular goal, which might not attain the good we seek or could come through happenstance. Okay, and that's when we were thinking about the grocer who might be fair because it's good for business. So we got to put away from our mind and morality all hope for effects. Okay, and when we remove subjectivity and the particularity from motivation, we're left with that sort of universality. And the question becomes, what rule determines what I ought to do in this situation? Becomes, what rule ought to universally guide action? So Kant is wanting to put this on a higher sort of level. Okay. And what we do in any situation of a moral choice is to act according to a maxim that we would will everyone to act according to. All right. Um, and then the other point that I just want to bring out here uh, is that the other problem with willing to make promising to pay money back while simultaneously, if I use that universality test, saying that I will not pay it back, involves myself in a contradiction. And a contradiction is against reason. Okay, so if I say something like, I am in the room and out of the room in the same way, in the same respect, at the same time, that's a contradiction. It's logically not possible for me to be inside a room and not in and inside the room in exactly the same manner and in the same way and at the same time. And I think we can all recognize that. Well, Kant would say it is also a contradiction of reason for me to make a promise while willing that there be no promise to be made. Okay. Making a promise and not making a promise in the same way, at the same time, in the same respect. That's just not possible. I'm either making a promise with the view to keep it, or I'm just lying to you. All right. So there's no way that you could will that sort of maxim about promise keeping to be a law of nature because it contradicts what nature is. Okay. And then we'll come here to this sort of third, well, what we will call our second version of the categorical imperative. All right. And this is what is meant to tie Kant's moral theory all together. So, insofar as something possesses a rational will, people are set off in the natural order of things. In other words, for Kant, human beings have special status. Okay, they are not merely subject to the forces that act upon them, and they are not means to an end. A human being is an end in themselves. For Kant, a human being is an end in itself. And all means to an end have merely conditional worth because they're valuable only for achieving something else. So the tree is valuable in this view of Kant's only because it can be used for firewood, it can be used for shade, It can be used if it's a fruit tree to gather food. Um, but beyond that, if it doesn't serve some end, it's not really subject to some sort of moral calculus. All right. So the possessor of a rational will, however, is the only thing with unconditional worth. So the possession of rationality puts all beings on the same footing. And then Kant will say, every other rational being thinks of his existence by means of the same rational ground, which holds also for myself. Thus, it is at the same time an objective principle from which, as a supreme practical ground, it must be possible to derive all possible laws of the will. So that's Kant, okay? And I know there's a lot there. You can certainly go back over the lecture and kind of view these slides a little bit if you need, and you can certainly ask me some questions. I'm going to just take a moment to stop, and we're going to go back to Mill, who is going to be a contrast to this, and we can probably get through that lecture in probably about 25 or maybe 30 minutes. So I'll be right back. All right, so we are back, and we are going to continue on with our idea of are looking at what these different philosophers have considered what is ethical. And now we're turning to our second philosopher for this week, and this is John Stuart Mill. And Mill is another very pivotal figure in sort of the history of philosophy, but also he has a great deal of impact in our own sort of civil society. Mill was a great champion for women's suffrage. So Mill is writing in the 1880s. So women's suffrage, the abolition of child labor. He was also sort of on the forefront of prison reform. So Mill would be considered sort of what we meant by maybe a liberal in the early 20th century, late 19th century, early 20th century, maybe even up to the mid 20th century. Obviously, these words have, because of our current usage of them today in the media and in politics, sometimes these words take on different sort of different connotations. But Mill is very much at the forefront of the way we think of ourselves as Americans, and particularly this sort of Western view that is developed beginning in the Enlightenment and moving forward. So where Kant, and so it's helpful to imagine two sort of I guess, sort of not extremes, but two sort of sides of a line. So on one point, you have Kant and his emphasis on duty. Okay, and if you remember, Kant wouldn't say that I do moral actions because I find them pleasurable, or I do moral actions because I'm just sort of inclined to be that way. That's just who I am. I don't do moral actions because of some hope for good or advantage that I might receive, either a personal advantage or maybe even a desired consequence that has larger social ramifications. The only reason why I do what I do is because my action flows from a goodwill that is seeking to do one's duty. And one's duty is seen in the light of one's reasoning capacity, is carried in through or carried out through one's reasoning capacity. Well, on the other end, we have someone like John Stuart Mill, and Mill would be although he would respect Kant, he would say, no, really the reason why we do anything is because there is a desired good that we wish to achieve at the end. There is some sort of consequence to our action. So we will go ahead and move along in our consideration here in utilitarian ethics. And so, what is utilitarianism? Well, in your reading, he states very early on that it is the creed which accepts, and a creed is sort of almost a statement of belief, like credo, I believe in Latin. A creed which accepts that the foundation of morals or utility or the greatest happiness principle holds that actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness, and wrong as they tend to produce the reverse of happiness. So that in itself is your definition of utilitarianism. Actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness, and wrong as they tend to produce the opposite, which would be unhappiness. And so at this point, the question would be, well, okay, well, what do you mean by happiness, Mill? And Mill tells you. He says, well, by happiness, I mean pleasure and the privation of pain or suffering. So at this point, that sounds not like a bad definition of what we would consider happiness to be. And so for him, the good then is that pleasure and freedom from pain are the only things desirable as ends, and that all other desirable things as means to the promotion of pleasure and the prevention of pain. All right, so here the idea is that what man is really looking for is to experience pleasure and to be free from pain. Those are the only things that are worth pursuing. And if anything is taken up other than that, there necessarily are going to be just means to an end of achieving that desired outcome of maximizing pleasure and minimizing pain. All right. Um, However, at this point, somebody might hazard the objection that, well, wait a minute. What do you mean by pleasure? Because there's certainly some things that individuals might find pleasurable that might actually be uh, detrimental to um, pursuing either for oneself or for one socially. So you could think of maybe people who start off and take illicit drugs of some sort, like heroin or something. I mean, was this what Mill means? Well, no, Mill sees that objection coming, and he's going to say that, look, uh, not all pleasures are created equal. So he would kind of contend that, look, um, it would be absurd that while estimating all other things, uh, quality is considered as well as quantity. The estimation of pleasure should depend on quantity alone. So, in other words, a human being has access to better and more varied uh, pleasures than animals. Now, some people might ask, is that egocentric? Well, Mill would just say, look, almost like Kant, um, that human beings are just of a different category than that of animals. Um, and that doesn't mean that either one would say that you should make an animal suffer needlessly, but we use animals for food. And if we think about pharmaceutical research, uh, before we start doing clinical trials on human beings, we try these on animals. And there's a certain sense in which it's unfortunate, but for Mill and Kant would say that's to protect human life. And so then if we move on from there, he says if there are two pleasures, okay, if I'm asked by what difference of quality and pleasure that I should be looking at, he says of two pleasures, if there be one to which almost all or almost all who've experienced both give a decided preference, irrespective of the feeling or moral obligation uh, to prefer it, that is the most desirable pleasure. Now, in your reading, this comes under the section where Mill is going to talk about the competent judge. Well, how do we judge which pleasures we should seek? And Mill says, well, you have to have a situation where there's someone who's acquainted with both types of pleasure. Let's just say a higher one and a lower one. Okay. And wherever that competent judge gives almost universal sort of affirmation of which pleasure is the better one, that is going to be the better pleasure. Now, you could ask, is this sort of culturally relative? And in some cases, it could be. I mean, in certain areas of our world, some things are valued more than others. Matters of taste and maybe dress or food, or maybe ways of living, how one approaches marriage or not marrying, or how one approaches work. And so all of these things can be a little culturally conditioned. But Mill would say, but if we look at something like being educated versus not being educated, well, universally, most people would say it's good to have education, at least to be able to read and write, uh, and to be able to study about and learn about the world instead of not being able to do that. Um, and so Mill's going to say that there is some sort of universal agreements on some things, that just because you may have a difference in how people might look at things, maybe from culture to culture or region to region, that doesn't necessarily, for Mill, preclude the possibility that there are some big universal things that we sort of all agree on. So this is where Mill is going to kind of come up and say that, look, it's sort of indisputable that the being whose capacities of enjoyment are low has the greatest chance of satisfying them. Okay. And a highly endowed being will always feel that any happiness which he can look for as the world is constituted is imperfect. So this gets to our idea of where Plato, or not Plato, I'm sorry, Mill brings up the idea of the difference in qualities of pleasures. Okay, so there's some sense when I was a small child, it took less to probably make me happy. Okay, uh, if I had Saturday morning cartoons, maybe a bowl of Lucky Charms, and then I could go outside and climb trees. That was pretty good. And for a child, there's nothing wrong with that. Okay. But as an adult, those sort of things don't necessarily appeal to me. And in fact, uh, I'm sure as some of you are finding out as you're getting older, depending on where you are in life, that life does have its struggles. Um, but you know, even amid where my life is now, and sometimes with the struggles that are going on and whatever, I would much rather have the life that I have now than the one I had when I was watching Saturday morning cartoons, eating Lucky Charms, and climbing trees. although there was a certain sort of carefreeness to that, there was also uh, certain things that I could not have enjoyed then that I can now enjoy, right? So he says that the person who's sort of highly endowed, and by highly endowed, he means in terms of their intellect, maybe their moral and aesthetic sensibilities, he can learn to bear the imperfections of life, and if they are at all bearable, and they will not make him envy the being who is indeed unconscious of the imperfections, but only because he feels not at all the good which those imperfections qualify. So then this is where you get Mill, and he makes this very famous statement that it is better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. It is better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied. And, you know, in some ways, this is today might sound as sort of a controversial statement because Mill is saying that, look, you can't have different types of people. And some people, their idea of happiness is on a lower level. So, you have the idea of, sex, drugs, and rock and roll. For some people, that's the ideal of happiness. There are other people who would say, well, certainly those things can give pleasure, uh, but I would almost rather be like Socrates, someone who was searching for the truth, living for the truth, and even at some point, if he's going to be tried and condemned for his fidelity to philosophical conversation and investigation, that he would much rather live that sort of life than live the sort of sex, drugs, and rock and roll existence. Or that sort of life would be better than just the sort of suburban existence with the house, with the swimming pool, and you go to work and they're sending kids. That's fine, but the idea is that even Socrates' suffering might have a higher value to it than just kind of the life that most Americans and probably people in the West are looking for. I just want a good job, a nice home, raise my family, and that's all I want to that's all I'm really interested in. Okay. So he would say, again, it is better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. Better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied. And he would go, if the fool or the pig were of a different opinion, it's only because they are limited to knowing only the side or their own side of the question. An intelligent or more intelligent being knows both sides. So Socrates might say, hey, when I was a younger guy, I liked to drink a lot and party and have a good time. But as I got older, I found out that that's not necessarily what life and the best life sort of consist in, and that the most pleasurable life does not consist in. Okay? So, in this sense, for Mill, utilitarianism is not strictly egocentric, which means that it's all about me and my pleasure. Okay, so the standard, he's going to say, of is not the agent's own greatest happiness, but the greatest amount of happiness altogether. And so that means not only his happiness or my happiness, it would be your happiness too. And it may be possibly doubted whether a noble character is always the happier for its nobleness, but there can be no doubt that it makes other people happier and that the world in general is immensely a gainer or is enriched by it. So, in other words, a noble person may not always feel happier because of their noble sort of bearing, but certainly people who are around the noble person are feel better, and the world is sort of enriched by that. Okay, so here Mill is conceiving of a sort of a philosophy that, yes, it does focus on pleasure, but we're making a distinction between higher and lower pleasures. Uh, you know, a lower pleasure might be, and I certainly availed myself of this during the pandemic, like most people. A lower pleasure would probably be watching Tiger King, right? A higher pleasure might be reading a novel, or reading Shakespeare, or attending the symphony, or something like that. So he's going to say there are higher and lower pleasures, and then those pleasures are not meant to be purely uh, subjective or just directed, self-directed. Okay, that my own happiness and pleasure is sort of bound up with yours as well. So he says the rules and precepts for human conduct, by the observance of which an existence such as been described might be, to the extent that it's possible, secured to all mankind, and not to them only, but so far as the nature of things admit, to the whole sentient creation. So in a certain sense, he's not even limiting this to merely human beings, but that other animals and somehow uh, are able to take part in this as well. If they do so, it's certainly not through anything they do, because they don't have free will, but that humans are acting in such a way and maximizing higher pleasures that it sort of uplifts everything. And so maybe in that sense, Mill might say you wouldn't have factory farming, where you have maybe all these chickens, and they are fed medicine to make them just gorge themselves so they can get bigger, and they don't get to run around, at least on a farm, and kind of be out in the sunshine and stuff, and they're kept in these kind of awful conditions. He said if humans had maybe nobler sort of aspirations, that maybe that sort of thing could be mitigated or avoided. Okay, so he says, what sort of proof would prove that utilitarianism is sort of the way to go? Well, he's going to say that can utilitarianism be supported by some sort of rational means? And the only way to prove that maximal happiness is the only desirable thing within itself is to ask, is this what people desire? And the answer would be, well, yeah, it is. Most people don't want a half happiness. They want as much happiness as possible. So, so it is the only end to happiness, maximal happiness. Preferring virtue to vice seems to be as prolific as preferring pleasure to pain. So how is it? So there is a certain critique here of of Mill by Aristotle, but we won't worry with that just yet. So he's going to reject virtue ethics as a sole mean. I'm going to come back to this later. That's not necessarily important for you to know right now. So if we think about the connection between justice and utility, the greatest argument, Mill says, against maximal happiness as a first principle is justice. The just must have an existence in nature as something absolute and generically distinct from every variety of idea. But then justice, by this definition, has two principles. It has a rule of conduct, okay, and that would be the first must be supposed common to all mankind and intended for their good. And then there's this idea of a sentiment which sanctions the rule. And the other sentiment is the desire that punishment may be suffered by those who infringe the rule. So here he's just going to say, and this is just briefly, that rights and justice, Mill thinks, needs to be seen synoptically, okay, as being two-parted. They're sort of residing partially in the injured person, so means that we have rights, okay, and then residing partially, excuse the typo, in the person doing the violating, okay, so that is justice, not as a separate element in the composition of the idea and sentiment, okay. These elements are a hurt to some assignable person or persons on the one hand, and a demand for punishment on the other. And so a right for him is to have something which society ought to defend me in the possession of. So in other words, society ought to defend my right to free speech, or the presumption of innocence, or the rights to the accused, or First Amendment sort of rights. Okay, so those are the things that I ought to be defended in having. And so why am I guaranteed rights? And he says, if the objector goes on to ask why it ought, he says, I can give them no other reason than the general utility. If you start saying that only certain people have a right to free speech, well, at some point that harms the general utility of the society. So part of the reason why we do this and we seek the maximal good or the greatest happiness is because it guarantees happiness for the greatest number of people. All right. And then just to kind of end on a couple of little things here briefly. The first thing to know is that utilitarianism is sometimes considered a consequentialist theory. So in other words, for Mill, in the pursuit of promoting happiness, that's the thing that is to be pursued. So we're looking for that consequence. And so for him, the greatest good, this is the first principle. It's the greatest good for the greatest amount. And the only intrinsic value is happiness. Okay? And so your axiom or rule of behavior is an act is good insofar as it promotes the greatest good. So sort of the greatest good for the greatest number of people. All right? And your measurement of success will be a bit instrumental. Good and bad lose definition outside of the amount of happiness produced. And therefore, this is why utilitarianism is called a consequentialist ethics, okay, or teleological ethics, in the sense that it's pursuing some end, okay. And so happiness here, Mill, remember, is talking about pleasure. There was another philosopher a little earlier than Mill named Jeremy Bentham, and happiness was defined by him as pleasure, or at least the absence of pain. Now Mill comes along and is going to kind of qualify that and saying that anything that causes pleasure, bodily, mental, or otherwise, pleasure to Mill has a qualitative distinction, not merely quantitative, which is what Bentham focused on. And so how do you measure the good? Remember that idea of the competent judge. If someone was trying to choose between two pleasures, you look for the competent judge who has had experience of both and gives his decided approval to the higher. So here, and this kind of cuts against maybe the liberal dimension, or what we think of the liberal dimension, maybe in Mill, is that not all opinions are equally valid on what is pleasurable. For Mill, the study of history, most people would say, and for him, the study of history would be a much greater pleasure and should be sought for than, binging Netflix series or something like that. Okay, so he's not going to have this idea that so long as you have the pleasure, then that's what makes the pleasure good. He's going to say there's just a difference between these. Okay, so it could be, is this egoism? But he's going to say no, it's not, and that the overall and general happiness is measured and not just merely the personal pleasure of the individual. Well, I guess here is where we're going to cut the lecture. I would encourage you, if you need to, go back through it. You can pause it and look at this if you need to. If you have any questions about what we've talked about today, I'll be more than happy to answer those questions for you. And unfortunately, we're not meeting face to face. And one of the things that I do when I have my face-to-face classes is I would always end every class with a poem. And the reason why I would do that is because a great philosopher and theologian, Thomas Aquinas, who is sort of expounding on an insight that the philosopher Aristotle, the Greek philosopher Aristotle, had, is that poetry and philosophy are connected because both are concerned with sort of the marvelous. And so I'll end here with this poem by the poet Richard Wilbur, who passed away. And this is called The Beautiful Changes by Richard Wilbur. One waiting fall meadow finds all sides, the Queen Anne's lace lying like lilies on water. It glides, so from the walker it turns, dry grass to a lake, as the slightest shade of you valleys my mind in fabulous blue lucernes. The beautiful changes as a forest is changed, by a chameleon's tuning his skin to it. A mantis arranged on a leaf grows into it, and makes the leaf leafier, and proves any greenness is deeper than anyone knows. Your hand holds roses always in a way that says they are not only yours. The beautiful changes in such kind ways, wishing ever to sunder things and things selves for a second finding, to lose for a moment all that touches it back to wonder. Well, you have a great week this week. I hope you enjoyed the poem. I hope you found something helpful in the lecture. If you have any questions or concerns, please feel free to email me. And next week we will turn our attention to Nietzsche.